This week on Quadriga, under attack, women in a man's world. Women are victims of violence all over the world. Just a few recent examples. In northern Iraq, young Yazidi women raped, forced into marriage, and sold. In Nigeria, 200 schoolgirls abducted by the Boko Haram Islamist terror group. In India, daily cases of rape are reported since the gang rape and murder of a 23-year-old woman on a bus shocked the world in December 2012. Around the world, women are being oppressed, subjected to genital mutilation, imprisoned in their own homes, sentenced to death by stoning. In many places, they're considered mere possessions of fathers, husbands, and brothers. The world is holding back the empowerment of women. Why do they not have the same rights as men? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. This week, Malala Yousafzai became the youngest person ever to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. She nearly paid with her life for insisting, as a girl, on the right to go to school. Why is gender-based violence so prevalent, and what solutions have proven effective? That's what we want to talk about today with three women who are following the situation of women in regions around the world. It's a pleasure to welcome Martina Sabra. She has worked as a journalist in the Middle East and North Africa for more than 20 years. She primarily covers migration, democratic development, and human rights. And Katarzyna Stoklosa. She is a professor at the University of Southern Denmark. She's of Polish origin and formerly headed the Central and Eastern European Department at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, it's a pleasure to have Catherine Wolf with us today. She's a research associate at the Global Public Policy Institute. She's a public international lawyer and has worked in the area of gender-based violence both in Germany and Latin America for German development cooperation institutions and the Inter-American Development Bank. I'd like to start out with a quick tour and ask each of you to give us a snapshot of the situation of women in the regions that you know best. And I'll start out in the Middle East with you, Martina Sabra. Certainly, it is, of course, the region that Malala comes from, and it has produced many very graphic images recently of gender-based violence. Give us a picture, if you would.
Well, the region I usually work on is the Arab world, the so-called Arab world, the North Africa and the Middle East, the MENA region. I think it is important to mention that there are big differences when it comes to talking about women, when it comes to the situation of women between these countries. Tunisia is by far the most progressive country. It has a legal situation where women are almost equal to men. They can have divorce, and they are very free. They have also a lot of chances in the labor market to work. At the other end is Saudi Arabia, where women are not even entitled to drive a car by themselves. So there is this huge difference already within the Arab world, not to speak of the Middle East. And I think two major issues at stake are mentalities, patriarchal mentalities, which are prevalent not only with men, also with women. Women tend to interiorize and pass on these patriarchal mentalities through generations. And then law, because in many Arab countries, not all of them, and there are discussions now in different countries like Morocco and other countries, but in many Arab countries up to today, violence against women is being permitted. It is still permitted by the law, explicitly. And of course, the most recent developments which are linked to conflict, the abduction of great numbers of Yazidi women, also the sale of these women, the trading of women by the terror groups in Syria and Iraq, of course, is a big tragedy.
And we want to come back to that in just a moment, but we will continue on our tour now, and I'd like to ask Katarzyna Stoklosa about Central Europe, Eastern and Central Europe.
Central Eastern Europe, the same. There are a lot of differences, but when we analyze and go deeper, there are a lot of similarities too. For example, Russia. Referring the status of the women, this is equal. It's really equal when we're talking about labor market, when we're talking about the status of the women, and they work in almost all places and present at the universities. And of course, this has to do with the communist past. During the communists, the status of women was very equal to the status of the men, and women had a family and at the same time the job. But of course, in comparison to Western Europe, it's not really equal, this status of women in Russia, because of patriarchal problem. It's the same Marina mentioned. Yes, so you have like this picture of women that should be very pretty and should be present in the society, but not really the same level as the men. But now, if we compare with Tajikistan or Azerbaijan, Russia's neighbors, scholars and ordinary people, they say, oh yes, Russian women, they are really equal, and we would like to have the same status as Russian women, because they are allowed to go to the public and to be pretty and to be present. This is what is not possible in Azerbaijan and Tajikistan.
And briefly, Katarzyna, if you would please, because we are very focused on violence. What about the prevalence of gender-based violence in Central and Eastern Europe?
Oh, it's very present too. It's different, and different from what you, Marina, described. If we talk about violence in Eastern Europe, it's present when we talk about prostitution, for example. We have, above all, in border regions between Poland and Germany, Germany and Czech Republic, Poland, Ukraine, Poland, Russia, we have a lot of women who work, yes, as prostitutes. And in the Netherlands, it's a very legal job. So we have like control, we have prostitution, and the women know their status. This is not the case in Eastern Europe. So we have prostitution, but we have violence.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, we will come back to some of those issues that you raised. Let's continue now to Latin America, possibly also Western Europe. You, Catherine Wolf, of course, have worked in this area in both places. Give us a snapshot, if you would.
What I can observe, also listening to both of you and the experiences that you shared, is that there are many parallels, which shows that this is a structural and a global problem, and yet the manifestations are very different. So when I walk the streets in Berlin, I feel more or less safe, yet I do get comments, I do get harassment, and I do have to look at so many sexualized women in advertisement and newspapers. And when I think of Latin America, I had a very similar feeling in urban areas where I felt like my physical integrity in public transport, for example, was not assured. But then when I moved to rural areas, and this is where I see a big difference, there are very different manifestations, such as, just to give a very maybe crude example, but that touched me very much, is the case of indigenous women being raped, who then have to marry the rapist. So this is where we see that even though the numbers aren't that different, 35% in Germany, 50 up to 70% in rural Peru, the manifestations are very different.
We've got a couple of snapshots of our own, starting with one story that made the headlines this year, namely that of the Yazidi women who were coerced and abducted.
In propaganda videos like this one, IS jihadists talk about slave markets and serial rape. They even released an official price list for women. These Yazidi women relate what they went through in 3 months of captivity in Raqqa, Syria.
There were 130 of us in a single house. They bought and sold us as they liked. Basically, I just want to die. Those men raped our bodies and they raped our souls. My heart is dead. Everything is finished. Many young mothers were abducted with their babies. The IS men threatened to kill our children if we didn't go with them. What could we do?
And another gender-based abduction that shook the world this year, the schoolgirls kidnapped by Boko Haram.
In April, more than 200 mostly Christian schoolgirls were kidnapped from Chibok in the northeast of Nigeria by Islamist militants Boko Haram. Calls for action came from around the world. America's First Lady was one of those to express her support online. 8 months later, some 50 have escaped, but the majority remain in captivity after having been forced to convert to Islam. Boko Haram has conducted a violent 5-year campaign to establish an Islamic caliphate in Nigeria. Thousands of lives have been lost. Unconfirmed local reports state that some of the Chibok girls have been sold into slavery as forced brides.
Catherine Wolf, let's talk briefly about the consequences of that kind of violence. I know you have worked in that area. One of the Yazidi women in that report said, basically, I just want to die. Those men raped our bodies and they raped our souls. Do experiences like these mark the women forever?
First of all, of course, they do mark the women forever, and they mark their whole society, because women are attributed a certain role in a society just as men are. The men are supposed to protect these women, especially in more traditional societies. And this is why they are used as objects of war rather than subjects. And as a consequence, this affects the whole society, because the victors will have claimed that the men could not protect their women. I would like to point out just one thing, is that I think we need to be careful when we talk about their dignity and having been destroyed, because in my opinion it is the rapist who has a lack of dignity in this case. And I think that we need to reinforce that image, that is the rapist's fault, and not look only at the woman as a victim.
Certainly, objectively, that would seem to be utterly correct. But subjectively, of course, there are deep scars. The WHO, Martina Sabra, says that violence against women is a major public health problem.
Yes, it is. It is a major public health problem, because it affects not only the women, it affects the women physically, it affects the women psychologically, but it also affects the entire families. It affects the children, the husbands, as Catherine mentioned. It destroys the entire social fabric. I mean, especially violence as rape in conflict. It is a weapon of war. It is a cheap weapon of war, and it is meant to destroy the social fabric. In the very specific context of IS, there is also another side to it. It helps to recruit men. Usually, it's not really the sexual lust which is behind these mass rapes. But in this particular case, I would reckon that there is also a side to it, that foreign fighters, are being attracted by telling them that this part of looting is yours, okay? But this is rare. The main aim is to send a message to the enemy that you are not able to protect the women, you are a loser, and we are able to take them. And this is very important. This is a very important message, and it's a very important weapon, and it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't need gasoline. It doesn't need ammunition. It is very cheap, and this is so tragic.
I'd like to come back in just a moment to the link between gender-based violence and conflict, but I know Katarzyna Stoklosa had something you wanted to add just a moment ago, and perhaps just staying with the question of consequences. If the consequences are so great, if this is a major public health issue, why is it that societies don't see it as in their interest to correct the problem? After all, women are potentially 50% of the workforce, and these are societies that presumably badly need that element for economic growth.
Sure. This is a very important issue, but this is what not only politicians and scholars have to understand. This is what people in this societies in the transition, because talking about Eastern Europe is still a society in the transition, have to understand. One example, that it's still not so easy. In my courses at the University of Flensburg, Northern Germany, I have students from more than 50 countries, and many of them are from Eastern Europe and from Asia and from Pakistan and other countries. And when we talk about political systems and history of democracy, they start talking about their daily problems, and most of my female students from these countries, that I agree with this role of women, that it's not really equal. So they start to explain me, no, women should stay at home and should cook and should be really help for the men. So I notice, okay, I have to start from the beginning and development of democracy, and what does it mean to make people understanding this value. So it's not so easy, because many of these victims that we see as victims perhaps don't really want it, but they don't want it because they don't have made this experience of being really equal and being free. And this is what we have to learn. And Catherine, I agree with you, this is not on a problem of women, this problem of a victim, and we see and we make these categories. Yes. But this is what we shouldn't do, because so we underline this border between women in the position of victim and men the position of patriarchs. So it's like our imagination, and we work with these pictures and with these roles. Okay, your role is as a woman and victim, and your role is as a man. So I agree, we should be careful.
Katarzyna Stoklosa just mentioned societies in transition. Societies in conflict are, of course, in a form of transition. What's going on there that creates this link to gender-based violence? Catherine Wolf?
I would suggest that looking at it as structural violence again is what helps us analyze the problem and also find solutions afterward. And what I mean by that is that we have to look at how colonialism and the introduction of capitalism into certain societies reinforces or changes gender roles as they existed before that. And then, to use the example of Peru again, or Latin America, we have a multi-layered aspect of patriarchy, of machismo. So we have old machismo, which is very traditional separated gender roles, and we have new machismo, which is Western patriarchy.
So let me ask you this. Under the old machismo system, would we have seen as much gender-based violence, or is it a function of the transition from old to new, or of the uncertainty of men about their own roles?
Conflict and post-conflict definitely aggravates the problem of violence against women. But I think we have to be very careful and not point too much towards others, but also look at what's going on in our own country or in our own countries. 9 million women being raped in Europe, in a European Union that is not that much in transition. We need to start looking at what's happening in our societies as well.
And let's do that, but I must say, if I look at the WHO statistics on gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence, there is no question that some regions have much higher incidence than others. Yes. And Martina Sabra, the number one is the Middle East and the Mediterranean region, as the WHO identifies it, including Africa. 37% of women there say they have been assaulted by their partners. So we're just talking about domestic violence in this case. Now, if I look at those two films we saw a moment ago, the Yazidi women, Boko Haram schoolgirls, the common denominator in both cases is conflict, but also Islam.
In a way, yes, but there are also conflicts where, very, very huge, large conflicts where Islam doesn't play that much of a role, which is, for example, Congo, where tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of women have been raped during the last years, and just, I mean, the world attention just wasn't there and still isn't there. I mean, except for some very courageous women, like, for example, Lauren Wolf from Women Under Siege from the States, who goes there regularly and reports, and other women. But Congo is huge. There is a real health problem there as well in terms of conflict and violence. But as you rightly say, there is a big problem with domestic violence, but to be frank, the figures are not that much lower in the West and in Europe. The point is, gender-based violence becomes a real problem when it is being tolerated. I mean, there are, for example, there is research on gender-based and sexualized violence in conflict. And this research has proven that if soldiers are being told not to rape, they rape much less. Which means that one big issue is the attitude. Right. Do I allow for this? Do I push morals away? Do I push them aside? Do I allow people explicitly to do it? And this also goes for domestic violence, the same. If a society banalizes and allows and tolerates this kind of violence, which is the case in many patriarchal societies, and at the same time does not have a legal framework which makes it which capacitates women or empowers women to go to court, for example, to go to the police, then this domestic violence is much more prevalent.
But then perhaps it's not so surprising if we see a correlation with Islamic societies. Isn't tolerance of violence against women quite entrenched in many of those societies?
I'm a bit reluctant to make this link, this intrinsic link between Islam and violence against women. We have violence against women in all monotheistic religions. And Hinduism, for example, is also very patriarchal and very misogynist. It is very much misogynist, very much against women. So we find this in all religions. In some respects, Islam is even more protective of women if it was applied. Yeah. If the protection measures which exist in Islamic law would be applied.
Katarzyna.
Martina, you are so right. We concentrate, in my opinion, too much on Islam and violence. And this is a connection between religion or religions and violence, or perhaps not always violence, but this patriarchal system. And you're right, we have it in all religions, in Christian religions.
Marital rape was abolished in Germany just some years ago, and after a very, very long debate, which I found personally definitely too long, but it was just abolished some years ago. So I think it's not a question of Islam.
On the other hand, I'm not agree. You thought, okay, Islam is like more defending women, so I'm not agree with this function neither, because it's again we work with the speakers, so this softy woman and should be defended. Mm-hmm. So perhaps it shouldn't be an aspect of religion to defend women because of violence or other issues.
Catherine Wolf, you have written in the past, it's not about Islam, it's about patriarchy, which is a point that's been made here a number of times. When I went to law school, we learned that rape is not a crime of sexuality, it's a crime about power. Would you say that's right?
I completely agree. And I think one example that shows that is the example that was previously shown on India. India is a country in which women are getting stronger and stronger. They're more and more empowered, educated, female employment is very high. And now we see men are scared. Men are scared of women becoming more empowered, certain men, not all men. But we see that there is a power struggle going on. And this is why also the rape in the public sphere, usually rape is also happening mostly in the private sphere, as most domestic violences. It's rising, and I think this illustrates the power struggle that is going on.
But you know what puzzles me about India? You mentioned earlier the country-city distinction. Yes. In fact, in India, we've seen in just the past year and a half or so, very brutal incidences of rape, both in urban metropolises and in the countryside, in very rural societies. How do you account for that?
My opinion is that we have failed to implement policies that work with boys and men. That is, we cannot just, I think in Eastern Europe we had very much a system of state feminism, for example, that didn't at the same time create societal change needed to fight gender-based violence. And I think we have the same problem in many different societies.
Katarzyna, you wanted to add?
You're right. And referring rape, it's always present during wars and afterwards, and for example, after the Second World War, rape was very present. For example,
used by Russian soldiers in occupied Berlin.
Exactly, in occupied Berlin or in Prague, in all cities, in all regions, rural regions. And it was, in most cases, not because of the aspect of violence against women, but it was like a proof to be the winner. Yes, it was violence against men from the other nationality. And
I would just like to add on this point, this opposition, rural and urban. I think it is not that easy. It's more complicated because there might be more violence in some respects against women in the rural areas, but because there is a lack of knowledge and a lack of education, maybe also a lack of control or accessibility of institutions for the women to protect themselves. But at the same time, different researchers have shed light on one fact, that urbanization is also in favor of violence against women and gender-based violence, because there is much more anonymity. Men feel protected by the public space, by the public anonymity. And this was very visible, for example, on Tahrir Square, where men inside a big mass of women, they sort of felt free to rape women, to strip them of their clothes, and so on and so on. Of course, there were cameras, and in the end, they were detected and discovered, and some of them were even put to trial. But in general, urban contexts do not make it easier for women. Many men, for example, they don't feel that they are being controlled by their peer groups, by their families, by their traditional social contexts, and they feel free to harass women. And this is very interesting, because harassment is on the rise, especially in some Arab countries, but also women's protests are on the rise, and this is a good sign. Like in India, also in other countries, women's protests are on the rise. They have all kinds of ideas. They create their own defense mechanisms, their NGOs, etc.
We've talked about the correlation between gender-based violence and societies in transition, societies in conflict, also any correlation that might exist with Islam. What about with poverty, Catherine Wolf? What is the link there?
Poverty, I think we try to create causal links, because it's so difficult to understand, to grasp the magnitude of this problem. But from what I've read and experienced myself, poverty, alcoholism, unemployment, remoteness, lack of access to justice are all just manifestations of fundamental societal problems, and are aggravating factors but not causal. I like it when, for example, especially with rape, there's a lot of times the question is, what was she wearing? What's the alcohol? And I like when people just say, there's one reason for rape, it's the rapist. And I think sometimes we need to be a bit more careful about creating causalities.
But when we want to look for solutions, don't we need to explore causalities?
Yes, but we need to understand what is causal and what is the reason for different manifestations. Same with rural and urban. I think what we can see is it's a structural problem that we experience everywhere in Berlin as well as in Cusco. The manifestations are different, and we have to address the manifestations with the solutions.
May I add to that directly? Or no?
Katarzyna had her hand up, and then we'll come to Martina. Go ahead, Katarzyna.
Yes, I agree, but on the other hand, you see, there is this correlation, and when we analyze Eastern Europe, this is, in many cases, alcoholism, and this is, this poverty in many regions that causes violence, because there are no rules. And example I gave from Eastern Europe, from a border region between Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Poland, and so on. And if we compare this border region with the German-Dutch, for example, border region, where we don't really have this problem of prostitution and violence, because there is a democratic system, control, and there's a very well-developed society in the economic sense. So it's very different in Eastern Europe. We don't have really democracy, democratic system. It's still in the transition. And it's not so rich in comparison to Western European regions. And we have this problem of violence procedures. So in my opinion, there is this correlation.
Correlation, yes.
Martina, briefly, if you would, because I do want to come to solutions.
It's again very difficult or very important to differentiate, because yes, if people are under stress, if they are poor, they are under stress, of course, and they resort to violence more often. This is clear. But what we also know from all researchers is that this is a phenomenon across classes, which means that academics and CEOs also beat their wives. The difference, where is the difference? It's the protection. A rich woman who is well off can protect herself by just getting a divorce and live alone. A poor woman maybe doesn't have the choice. She cannot get out of the relationship. This is where the correlation is. But this means that it's, again, structural. It's not by making this woman richer or giving her a better income that the violence will disappear. The violence will disappear when we debanalize the violence, when we create mechanisms and new mentalities and also new laws.
So let's talk about some of those solutions now. And I'd like to return to the story of Malala, who told the Nobel audience that change is coming.
17-year-old Malala Yousafzai is the youngest person to ever win a Nobel Prize. She's also the first Pakistani to win the Peace Award. She shares this year's prize with fellow children's rights activist Kailash Satyarthi. Those attending applauded the two recipients for their selfless work. The prize committee commended Malala for her clear vision and tireless courage. Malala grew up in northern Pakistan. From an early age, she spoke out in support of girls' rights and against the extremist ideology of local Taliban groups. But her advocacy nearly cost her life. In 2012, a Taliban terrorist boarded her school bus and shot her 3 times in the head. Malala was lucky to survive.
Malala said that she will continue fighting for her dream for every child, but especially every girl, to go to school. Martina Sabra, is education a key part of the solution here? We know that women who have been better educated tend to have fewer children, have less tendency to live in poverty. Would they also have less tendency to become victims of violence?
Well, at least, as I said, they can protect themselves better. I think it is very important to have these figures, these important figures like this brave young woman who break the silence, who debanalize the violence, who speak out loudly. This is the most important thing. It is very important to help them. Education is a factor, but education can also create new problems if the men are not with us in the boat. Because education makes women stronger, but it also makes women a threat to men. So I think we need a real gender approach, which means that men and women are being targeted. Men with their mentalities and women with their mentalities. And men have to be with us as women in the boat, I think.
Catherine Wolf, what kind of measures did you see being put into practice in Latin America that you considered to be effective? I know you worked there on gender-based violence solutions. Were any of them working well?
I think so. Working well is difficult to determine when you work on societal changes. They take decades, they take centuries until you see results. However, in the program I worked for had 3 components that consisted of economic empowerment, improvement of access to justice, and at the same time creating general public awareness. And I think in that sense, combining efforts, looking at different strata of society, different sectors of society, I think that's what we need to look at. But one more thing, and Malala is kind of, for me, is also a very positive image for that. We don't have a lot of young women talking or being heard. We don't have a lot of non-Western women being heard. So I think this is something that we still need to learn. Before we go in somewhere, first listen. And not just listen to some prime minister, but listen to women on the ground, not just as victims but as actors and what they really need and what they really want.
You worked with development organizations on an international level, the WHO and also UN for Women. They both recommend such prevention strategies as microfinance, which you mentioned, economic empowerment, combined with training for boys and girls in communication and relationship skills. That sounds great, but how many men are going to be willing to participate in a program like that? Or how many boys?
That depends a lot on how you go about the whole thing. It's difficult because when you really believe in something, like in women's equality or in women's rights, you want to go in there and you want to change the world. But sometimes you just have to take a step back and learn to use other people's language, learn to not use certain words, learn to adapt to cultural circumstances, and I think then it can work.
We talked some about the importance of rule of law. Katarzyna Stoklosa, it was quite interesting for me. I was looking at when policies against domestic violence were adopted in different regions. In Latin America, they came pretty much directly after around the 2000s, so about 10 years after the Iron Curtain had fallen. Those laws began to be put on the books in most countries in Eastern and also Central Europe. But the big question, of course, they're on the books. Are they being adequately enforced?
You're right. First, these books came too late. This is the first problem. The other problem is whether these books and results of research and political analysis and political decisions, whether they really have been read and accepted by the society. And you're so right, Katrina, when you say that we have first to learn about other perspectives and other visions, other points of view and cultures. Again, this example with my students, for me it was so clear that we have these Western values and women and men have to be equal, that it was like something for sure. And I started with my class. And everything was destroyed because it wasn't for sure to my students. So how do you want to teach about our common values to the public that perhaps isn't agree with your visions? And it's so fascinating and romantic story about Malala. But I read analysis how her vision has been, whether has been accepted in her country, and it isn't the case. He has been criticized so much by other women, by young women. It's so depressing, but this is when we start to understand that we have to know these other points of view and other understanding of the world before we start teaching our teaching of Western values, democracy and equality.
Martina Sabra, apparently she is seen actually by many people as something of a Trojan horse, bringing alien Western values, perhaps even serving as a mouthpiece for outside interests. I believe she's been accused of that. What's that about, and how can that be changed?
I think that's pure propaganda. This is usually being put forward by people who have no problem to use Western banks, Western or Asian mobile phones, and so on. This is an excuse. This is a culturalist argument which I do not accept personally, because I think there are universal values. They may have different colors, they may look a bit Islamic, they may look a bit Hinduistic, they may look Buddhist, but there are certain universal values like the Declaration of Human Rights and all the conventions which come after this Declaration of Human Rights. And I do not take this. I think that her case is very important, but it may take time to swallow it for many people. And I think it's also important to see, as Catherine said, that in so many countries, many things have changed. I used to work not only as a journalist, but also as a consultant for gender-based violence. And I had the privilege to witness the unfolding of the women's movement in Morocco in the 90s. And I know that in 1993 there was not a single center where battered women, where women who were being beaten by their husbands would be able to address to. Today there are 40. And they have all been created by different groups of women in Morocco. And many people are still not aware of this, not even in Morocco sometimes. But this kind of developments are very important. Create protection mechanisms. The rule of law is very important. It is even more important than ballot boxes and elections. The rule of law is crucial. But also in economic empowerment and protection mechanisms at all levels, at the low level, regional level, but also at the UN level, like resolutions we have to protect women in conflict, etc.
Catherine Wolf, you are a public international lawyer, meaning you specialized in part in the international legal system that includes treaties, international organizations. What can we do at that level to help ensure real change?
That's probably the most difficult question you can ask an international lawyer. I see international, transnational, regional, national and local law, it's a ping-pong game. And we don't have to take the assumption or make the assumption that once we have a treaty here, we will reach impact here. We have to look at every different level, what are implementation measures, and most importantly, how many funds do we need, how much money do we need, and who do we have to ask? Who are the people on the ground who need the services that we want to provide? And here, it's a mix of lack of funds and lack of political will.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us. And thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. Bye-bye.